Oh my. Why, hello there. I wasn't expecting to see you here. You're quite the sight for sore eyes, aren't you? If you're watching this video, I assume it's because you want to learn a new system of stylized shading for characters in Blender. I don't want to have a long preamble, and you don't either. For a quick gloss over of how this video will work, I'm covering an alternative to usual normal editing. Normally, when you edit a normal, if you deform the mesh, it'll recalculate the normal and ruin your work. This system is more intuitive, non-destructive, and with cleaner results. The end goal of this node system is an easy way to manually control the normals of a mesh with empties. So if I just pause this video here, if I grab this empty and start rotating it around, it will react to the light. Ooh, ooh, and it works with all of them, if I can select one. Ooh, ooh, ooh. You block off sections of shadows using sharp edges on the mesh, like so. Then you place these empties onto shadow areas and rotate them to control the normals. And you don't have to be super precise with it. See, I'm moving it around. Oh, but if I move it too far. Oh, but if I bring it back. Also, as you can see, if I rotate this jawbone, the normals don't get messed up like they usually would. And I can rotate the whole head, and it reacts dynamically to the light as I do so. That's another very big part of this system. This system is very plug and play. Once you build it once, it maybe takes like a minute of setup for each new project, and it just works. Now I know you're dying to learn how this works, and you're in luck, because I'm going to show you. Get ready. Part 1, Mesh Setup. So here I have a very bare bones project. I only have the mesh, its skeleton, and the sun. I don't have any materials, no geometry nodes, I just have this modifier stack. I'm going to try to include related project files in the description below, so you can follow along with this tutorial, or you can just get to the goods and steal the node system. So to set up the mesh, all we need to do is go into edit mode, make sure we're in edge select mode, and then section off each place where we want shadows to be. So I'll just go do that now. Mark sharp. Mark sharp. Mark sharp. Mark sharp. I also just like to get the edges just for cleanliness sake. And now we're done with setup. It was that easy. Again, all you do is just select the edges surrounding a section of mesh along edges of shadows, and then you mark them as sharp. With that done, we can get into the fun part with geometry nodes. Go into the modifier stacks, add a geometry node modifier, and bring it up just below the mirror modifier. Click New, and name it something like Fast Normals. What we want to do at this stage is to just make the mesh get the average normal of each split section. So like here, we want it to grab the average normal of this section, so on and so forth. We want to make it do that automatically. One way we can do that is by splitting the mesh along each split edge. So let's grab a named attribute and a split edges. In the named attribute, we want to grab the sharp edge and drag it into the selection. And now the mesh is being split up along each sharp edge, and we can make it do certain operations for each island of mesh. I'm going to put this up here. Now we want to grab two accumulate field nodes. Basically what accumulate field does is that it looks at groups and then it totals up the value per group. And because we split up the mesh, it'll accumulate the value for each island of mesh. So let's grab a mesh island index. And because we were trying to average the normals, let's grab a read normals input. Put a pin in this. Put a pin in this. Let's rename it to change later. We're just using normal as an example. Change the data type to vector. Put island index in the group ID and the normal into the vector. In the other accumulate field, change it from float to integer and group ID island index. Grab a vector math node, put the totals into each value, and choose divide. We want to divide because this gets us the total average normals. We want to divide it by the island index to normalize it. Now with this, we want to grab a capture attribute, change it from float to vector, and plug in the vector into value, and the split edges into geometry. Plug the geometry into the geometry output, and drag the attribute output into the group output. Open up the side panel, and name the vector attribute. Name it something like normal output. And make sure the attribute is changed from point to face corner. Gonna clean this up a little bit. I'm just gonna grab these all together, put them in a frame with Control J, rename it with F2, name it average island. So we built this small system, but it doesn't actually affect the normals of the mesh. Geometry nodes can't directly write onto the normals, and it can't read custom normals either. But that's fine because we output the normals as an attribute. We can read that attribute in shaders. Part 3, build preview shader. Go into materials and add a new material. Delete principled BSDF, we don't need it. Oh, change to shader material preview or rendered mode, just so you can see what you're doing. Grab an attribute node and name, because we named it normal output, put normal output in the name. Now if we preview vector, oh right, in the output attributes, here you name it normal output. Oh, typo, output, there we go. So it helps to look at the normals more directly like this, but because vectors can use negative values, it can make half the mesh hard to read. So we can grab another vector math node and change it from add to absolute. So now we are looking at the absolute value of each average vector normal for island of mesh. It's a lot of words. With this, you can also grab a shader BSDF, diffuse BSDF, plug the vector into normal, then a shader to RGB, because Eevee, and then a color ramp. This way you can see it more like you would an actual shaded character. I also like to grab the hue saturation value, plug the shaded into value, and vector into color. That way we can get both. We can see it shaded and the normals. Whatever setup you want to use to make it easier to read. So although this is a good starting point with averaging the normals and being able to preview it, we want to have more control over our normals. That's the whole point of this setup. So it's time for part 4, placing the empties. Go into or create a new collection name it something like normal empties. Go into edit mode on your mesh. And what you're going to want to do here, in face selection mode, select each island of mesh. You want to limit it by sharp, and then do cursor to selected. That'll place your 3D cursor at the average point of your entire selection. Back in object mode, grab an empty. I like to do single arrow. Name it something like normal target .000. You can use whatever display you like, but I just like the arrow. Scale it down and rotate it out about where you would want the normals to be looking at, and just do that for each island. Cursor to selected. Now you can just duplicate this. Selection to cursor. Maybe rotate it a little. But you also don't need to be super precise with these empties. It helps to, but you don't have to be. So I'm just going to put this here, change it to snapping to face, and you will see that it's fine. You don't have to be super precise with these right now, because the way this is set up, you can change them at any time, but still. Another one here. Like that. Here. One last one down here. Because it's such a big section, I will put it directly at the center. Now that we have all our normals, we can grab them all and parent them to the armature. Parent as an object. Now we can move on to step 5. Capture empty rotation. We can't just automatically plug the rotation of these empties into the node group and expect it to work, because it doesn't know that it wants us to use the normals, and it also doesn't know which one to reference. It doesn't know which one to reference for each mesh island. But what we can do is turn these normals into usable geometry, and then project the normals of that geometry back onto the mesh. Grab a collection info node and a group input node. We want to reference the normal empties collection and plug it into the group input. Make sure to tick separate children and switch it to relative. We want to capture the rotation of each empties rotation. Oops. Capture attribute, change it to vector, and instance. Plug instances into geometry, and then grab a instance rotation and plug that into value. The best way to transfer these normals would be to reference a flat plane. So in mesh, grab a mesh primitive grid, and we're going to want to put them on instances on points. Drag mesh into instance, and we'll want to use the position of these empties to drive the points. So grab an instance to points node, geometry into instances, points into points, and then drag the captured attribute into rotation. And let's preview this. The planes are a bit too large, but we can just scale them down like so. The size doesn't really matter, but it makes it more readable. And if we want to use this geometry, we have to realize these instances. And because we want to be able to use it on both sides of the mesh, we'll have to mirror it. Grab a transform geometry node, plug it into there, scale the X down to -1. And if you do that, if you check the backface culling, you'll see that they're flipped around. So grab a flip faces node, plug it before or after, it doesn't matter. And then a join geometry node, and bring in the previous geometry before transformation. And now we have some planes that we can use to grab normals from. I'm going to tidy this up a little. And for future use, I'm just going to join these all into a group. So now we have this node group that we can pull information from. Now we want to move on to step 6, capture normals to mesh. Let's take down that pin we put up earlier. This change later node, let's put in a position node. This will totally mess up our shading, but that's fine. what we want to do is sample nearest surface. Change this from float to vector. Plug in the planes into mesh. Grab a normal node. Plug it into value. And now, because this is grabbing the average position of each island, we can drag in this attribute into the sample position and drag this into normal output. Now we're really getting there. If we rotate this around, we see that it automatically adjusts normals based on the rotation of these empties, just like we want. But I'm sure you've noticed by this point that our mesh has a problem. Our mesh has these holes and these tears along it, and that's because we split the mesh up. We split the mesh up into those islands using those sharp edges. But we can bring back the original geometry without losing any of the information. So grab the group input node again, grab a capture attribute, plug geometry into geometry, float to vector, change this to face, grab a position node, duplicate sample nearest surface, plug the attribute into sample position, and bring in the split geometry because that's what we're sampling from. So now we have the original mesh, but with the new normal information. So with this setup, let's just put everything into a nice, fancy, clean, organized frame. Capture normal. So this is all fine and dandy. However, if you rotate this head bone around, it'll rotate the mesh, but it won't affect the normals at all. Which, like, maybe that's fine, but I don't think that's fine at all. I think that's disgusting. But it's something that can be worked around. So let's move on to step 7, rotate normal. Back in object mode, let's add yet another empty. Make sure it's not in the same normal empties collection from before, because we don't want this to be affecting the red normals of the mesh. Scale it down a little, put it on the head bone, and then parent it to the head bone. Name it something like normal rotation. Let's go back onto our head, back into geometry nodes. We just have to do one last simple thing. Grab another group input, grab object info, let's sample the empty, drag this into group input, grab a vector rotate node, pop that between the nodes, change axis angle to Euler, and plug rotation into rotation. And now when this rotates, it'll make the normals rotate. And it works with the bones as well. I wish we could just skip the middleman and directly read from the bone, but unfortunately we can't. We can't have everything. Throw this into another frame, name it rotate normal. Now I want to give this a nice fleshy skin tone, just to really bring it all together. So bring this into value, change this to just all the way red. This down, bump the hue up a little, more orange, bring the saturation down. Perfect. And that's about it. We can update these normals in real time. You'll probably put them on a rig. They don't deform at all. I mean, the mesh deforms, but the normals stay the same, which is what we want. Now that we are finished, I think it's time for some closing thoughts. I would really like to thank a version of reality, aka Asalon, for really getting the ball rolling on this. I did not know about the accumulate fields nodes, and it really simplified the system. At first, I used a large loop zone, which was just extraneous. He was a big help. He also suggested that there's similar ways of doing this with UV layouts instead, and I don't doubt him, but it's just being on my scope, and frankly, I think this is fine enough. There's probably at least 10 different ways I can improve this setup, and if I'm correct that other people have done a similar technique before, I'm sure they've done it more professionally. There's definitely ways of skipping the step of making geometry for each empty. You could just skip the middleman and use actual plane objects. Maybe you could convert empty rotation into normals more directly, but I don't know how. Maybe you could add more control with vertex groups and colors. You can simply append these node groups into new projects, but it can be a bit tedious placing each empty. This structure will probably not work with complex deformation, such as on torsos and limbs, because I built this for heads, because that's generally what people use normal editing for most of the time anyways. This is bothering me. I'm going to lower this down a little, because I can do that, because that's what this system is built for. If I knew how to code, I'd write a little button down that could automatically generate empties for you with the correct position and rotation automatically and everything, but alas, I do not know how to code. You can simply append these node groups into new projects, but it can be a bit tedious placing each empty, even if it only takes like a minute at most. Sometimes we can't make everything perfect all at once, but we always need a place to start. That said, thanks for being here for me. I needed that today. I love you.